Hello guys, today I wanted to talk about the iPhone 15 and my experience using it for the past 6 months. First of all, let's talk about the design.
iPhone 15 has an all-new design.
In comparison to the 14 and 14 Pro, the 15 now has a more rounded design, and because of a new design, it feels much more better to hold. I know in the past years, users have complained that the sharp edges of the iPhone kinda dig in your hand, so Apple decided to change that. Actually, the iPhone 15 now kind of resembles the design of the iPad Pro, also because it's made of aluminum and not titanium or stainless steel as the previous Pro model. It feels much better in the hand because it's so much lighter. Also, Apple added the dynamic island from the iPhone 14 Pro to the iPhone 15. Actually, the iPhone 15 uses a lot of parts from the 14 Pro, and we'll talk about that later. The dynamic island is a great addition to the phone looks-wise, but to be honest, it isn't improving the functionality of the phone really much. All it really does is improving the phone's aesthetics. The dynamic island looks a bit better in my opinion than the cutout for the notch, but that's about it, to be honest. Unfortunately, for some reason, iOS still doesn't use the dynamic island as much. I feel like the dynamic island has much more potential, so hopefully iOS 18 will bring more features to the dynamic island, but for now it's just an aesthetic thing. Also, thanks to the EU, the iPhone 15 now finally has USB-C, but since Apple likes being Apple, it's limited to lightning speeds. So the USB-C in the iPhone 15 is still limited to USB 2.0 speeds, and it still doesn't support fast charging, unlike the 15 Pro, because the 15 Pro actually supports faster charging and faster transfer speed. Also, because Apple wanted you to buy the 15 Pro instead of 15, it doesn't have the action button, it still uses the switch. But to be honest, I haven't found much use for the action button, so not missing much. Alright, let's talk about the display. And to be honest, the display is the same as on the 14, with the exception of dynamic island instead of a notch. Quality-wise, it's still the same display, and that's not a bad thing per se, because the display of the iPhone is incredible. It's very sharp with very true to light colors. The only downside is it still uses a 60Hz panel in comparison to the Pro version of the iPhone, which uses 120Hz. But if I'm being honest, most people won't really notice the difference between a 60Hz and a 120Hz display. 120Hz basically means that the display has twice the refresh rate of the 60Hz display, which makes it feel much smoother. But to be honest, iOS is pretty smooth as it is, so you don't really notice the difference on an iPhone between 60 and 120Hz. The biggest problem is though that the Pro model has an LTPO display, which means it can only go to 120Hz, it can also go as low as 1Hz, and that basically allows the iPhone to have an always-on display. The iPhone 15 doesn't have that, it's always stuck at 60Hz, meaning that you don't get an always-on display with the iPhone 15, which is really unfortunate because the iPhone 15 doesn't get the iOS 17 standby feature that was implemented last year with the 14 Pro, which basically means that you get the latest iPhone and it's missing software features that the previous iPhone had. Let's talk about the performance. So the iPhone 15 uses the last year's iPhone 14 Pro chip, and it's not necessarily a bad thing because the A16 is really fast, but it's kind of unfortunate that you get the latest iPhone and don't get the latest chip unless you buy the Pro model. But with that said, despite having the last year's iPhone hardware, it still gets new features which the 14 Pro doesn't, despite having the same chip. Nevertheless, the A16 performs really well, especially in day-to-day basic needs. Games also run exceptionally well on the A16, and to be honest, the A17, which you can find in the Pro model, is not that much faster. It's actually more power efficient than faster. That's also the reason Apple decided to use the A16, the newest base model iPhone. And since I mentioned the battery, the iPhone 15 has had actually a really great screen on time. After 6 months, the battery has still not degraded, it's still at 100%. For comparison, the 14 Pro that I got last year is now at 80% battery health, and I've only been using it for 1.5 years. So the batteries in the iPhone 15 seem to be a bit better than last year's iPhones. Overall, the iPhone 15 performs really well and has great screen on time. Alright, let's talk about the cameras, because Apple has actually improved them quite a bit. Despite using the last year's iPhone chip, the sensor is not quite as big as in the 14 Pro, but it has a faster aperture to make up for it. The aperture on the 15 is f1.6 in comparison to f1.8 on the 14 Pro, and because of that, more light hits the sensor before the shutter closes. Not only that, Apple has actually added quite a few software features to the camera, like auto portrait mode. Now you can shoot regular photos without portrait mode, and portrait mode will actually actually trigger automatically if it detects a human or a pet. Also, portrait mode will trigger if you tap to focus. And actually, if you want to, you can go in and edit the photo later. You can change the focus and the depth, which was previously not possible with iOS 16, but with iOS 17, even the 14 Pro got that feature. Except the older iPhones can't automatically shoot in portrait mode. And the way the auto portrait mode feature works is it actually captures depth data in real time. If you want to, you can use that data later to activate portrait mode on a photo that was not shot in portrait mode. Samsung has had that feature, but it doesn't quite work the same because Samsung actually applies fake blur to the photo to make it look like a portrait mode, and the iPhone actually captures the depth data. So when you go ahead and use portrait mode after the fact, it actually uses the data from the sensor to make a more accurate portrait mode picture. Actually, if you want to, you can now zoom into your picture and it will still capture the depth data, so you can take a picture at 3x or 5x and it will look like a telephoto, except the picture quality won't be as good because it will crop in from the main sensor because the iPhone 15 doesn't have a telephoto camera. Also, because the iPhone 15 now has a 48 megapixel sensor, it actually takes those pixels and binds them together to get you a 24 megapixel picture. And you might ask, why would I want that instead of 48 megapixel picture? But the thing is that the sensor is so small that the more megapixels you put onto the sensor, the smaller the pixels are. So instead of using all the 48 megapixel sensor, it binds them together to give you a better looking picture. And if the iPhone detects a low light situation, it'll actually bend the pixels once again, giving you a 12 megapixel image. So it sacrifices the size of a picture, but not the quality of a picture. But of course, if you want to, you can go into settings and make it always shoot 48 megapixel. I would actually advise against that because the iPhone knows what it's doing. But if you always want to have the biggest file size and the biggest picture, go ahead and do that. Except for night mode. When it uses night mode, it always gives you a 12 megapixel picture, no matter the settings, because the low light situations actually require bigger pixels, so it always pins them down to 12, which gives you a much more better looking image. Overall, the iPhone 15 has a great point-and-shoot camera, but I would say if you want more control over camera, actually buy a Pro model. I would actually suggest you buy the last year's iPhone 14 Pro, because despite being older, the Pro model has more features to offer, like Pro RAW and a telephoto camera, and you're not even sacrificing image quality because the 14 Pro shoots 48 megapixel pictures as well. The 14 Pro actually has a bigger sensor, so when you're shooting 48 megapixel, the end result will be better. Also, the 14 Pro has a better display. It goes from 1 Hz to 120. It has always on display. It has a very smooth 120 Hz display, which makes the overall experience of using the phone quite a bit better. And even if you can't notice the difference between 60 and 120 Hz, you will definitely notice the difference when you go back from 120 Hz to 60. The 60 Hz screen will feel very choppy after using a 120 Hz screen panel. Overall, the iPhone 15 is a great phone. It actually held up pretty well. We have not used a screen protector and the screen barely has any scratches. Also, the phone has been dropped a few times and the ceramic shield has held up pretty well. The display didn't shatter. So overall, I would say it's a great buy if you want to have a latest iPhone. But if you want to have more value for your money, I would actually recommend you get a 14 Pro, because the Pro iPhone, despite being an older phone, has much more to offer. If you want to see me do a full comparison between the 14 Pro and the 15, please write that down in the comments. If you have any questions about the 15, please leave them down in the comments. I'll try to answer them as best as I can. And if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. I'll see you next time.